They told the world he had a rare, aggressive autoimmune disease. The truth, the most powerful immortal in North America, was rotting from the inside out. 15 elite specialists walked into his chamber. None could stop the decay. But the girl changing his bedsheets, she didn't just cure him, she woke the beast. The contract sitting on the steel table in front of Nora Hayes offered $50,000 for exactly 1 week of work. To the men in the tailored Tom Ford suits standing across from her, it was petty cash. To Nora, it was salvation. It was the exact amount required to stop the foreclosure on her childhood home in South Boston and pay off the crippling debt from her mother's terminal stay at Massachusetts General Hospital. All she had to do was provide end-of-life palliative care to a high-net-worth VIP in a private estate in the Hudson Valley. "You understand the stipulations, Ms. Hayes?" asked Victoria Pierce, a woman whose cheekbones looked sharp enough to cut glass. "You will be blindfolded during transport. You will have no phone, no internet access, and no contact with the outside world. If you speak to the press, or to anyone, about what you see inside the Ashford estate, the non-disclosure agreement permits us to pursue legal action that will mathematically ruin your bloodline for 3 generations. Nora, 24, exhausted and running on 3 hours of sleep and cheap diner coffee, picked up the pen. "I've worked hospice for 4 years, Ms. Pierce. My patients die, I clean them up, I comfort the families. I don't gossip." She signed on the dotted line. She didn't know that the patient wasn't entirely human, and the family was a ruthless syndicate of vampires who controlled half the world's pharmaceutical and banking industries. The transport took 3 hours. When the blindfold was finally removed, Nora found herself in the subterranean medical wing of a sprawling, Gothic revival mansion. It didn't look like a hospice. It looked like a cutting-edge bio-containment facility mixed with a medieval cathedral. She was immediately ushered into a prep room by Dr. Arthur Pendleton, a world-renowned hematologist whose sudden retirement 2 years prior had made international news. Now she knew where he had gone. "You are not here to treat him," Dr. Pendleton said, his voice clipped and dripping with condescension as he shoved a tray of saline bags and sterilized cloths into her hands. "You are here to clean the weeping wounds on his extremities, change the linens, and monitor the IV drips. The king," Pendleton caught himself, clearing his throat. "Mr. Ashford is in the final stages of a highly aggressive cellular necrosis. Do not speak to him. Do not look him in the eye if he wakes. Do your job and get out of the way of the professionals." Nora nodded, slipping on double layers of latex gloves. When she finally entered the primary suite, the sheer concentration of wealth and panic was suffocating. 14 other medical professionals, surgeons, supernatural geneticists, holistic energy healers, and blood magic practitioners that Nora couldn't even begin to comprehend, were clustered around a massive, climate-controlled glass canopy bed. This was the Royal Healing Council. For 3 weeks they had thrown every modern scientific breakthrough and ancient arcane ritual at the man lying under the glass, and they had utterly failed. Dominic Ashford looked like a fallen god. He was impossibly beautiful, with sharp, aristocratic features and midnight dark hair plastered to his forehead with fever sweat. But a terrifying, unnatural decay was eating him alive. Deep, pulsing black veins spiderwebbed up his neck, and his pale skin was cracking like dry porcelain, weeping a dark, silver-laced fluid. Nora stood in the corner, clutching her tray, as the elite healers bickered. "The silver nitrate poisoning has bonded to his marrow," yelled Dr. Miriam Croft, slamming a clipboard onto a nearby desk. "If we do another total transfusion, his body will reject the donor blood. We've gone through 40 bags of O negative today alone. If we don't transfuse, The necrosis reaches his heart in 48 hours, countered a tall, predatory-looking man with crimson eyes. Cassian Ashford, Dominic's younger brother. Nora felt a primal shiver run down her spine just looking at him. Cassian didn't look grief-stricken. He looked impatient. "My brother is the sovereign of this territory. We cannot let him die because you cowards are afraid to try the Hemlock Protocol. The Hemlock Protocol will burn his remaining nervous system to ash," Pendleton shouted back. As the millionaires and immortals screamed at each other, Nora quietly stepped up to the glass canopy. The machines monitoring Dominic were flashing yellow. His core temperature was dropping. The dark veins on his arms were spreading visibly, creeping toward his chest by the millimeter. No one was paying attention to the patient. They were too busy arguing over the politics of his death. Nora felt a familiar, dull ache in her chest. She had seen this exact scenario 100 times in the mortal world. Doctors treating the disease like a puzzle to be solved, entirely forgetting the human being trapped inside the suffering. She quietly unlatched the side panel of the glass canopy. The air inside was freezing, smelling of copper and ozone. Carefully, strictly following her limited instructions, she took a sterilized cloth and gently began to dab the weeping silver fluid from Dominic's cracked knuckles. For the first 3 days, this was her existence. Nora was the ghost in the room. She watched as the 15 royal healers tried increasingly desperate, agonizing procedures. They injected him with synthesized werewolf adrenaline. They burned ancient protective runes into his chest. They pumped his veins full of experimental nanobots. Nothing worked or worked. In fact, Dominic was dying faster. And the more Nora watched, the more she began to notice something deeply disturbing about the treatments. It was 3 a.m. on Nora's 4th night. The medical suite was eerily quiet. Cassian Ashford had taken the exhausted healers to the dining hall for a strategy meeting, leaving Nora completely alone with the dying king. The silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, agonizing hiss of the ventilator pushing air into Dominic's paralyzed lungs. Nora approached the bed to change out his IV bags. As she looked at the medication lines, her brow furrowed. She wasn't an immortal geneticist, but she had spent her entire adult life administering intravenous medications. She traced the line coming from a dark, amber-colored bag that Dr. Pendleton had hung an hour ago. The label read, L-carnosine stabilizer, but the fluid was highly viscous, and the tubing was cold to the touch. Nora frowned, pulling a spare syringe from her pocket and drawing a tiny fraction of a milliliter from the line. She dropped it into a sterile metal basin. The moment the liquid hit the steel, it hissed, slightly corroding the metal. Silver nitrate. Nora's breath hitched in her throat. The treatments weren't failing. The treatments were the poison. The 15 royal healers, or at least Pendleton, under Cassian's orders, weren't trying to save Dominic Ashford. They were quietly, methodically executing him while maintaining the illusion of desperate medical intervention. A sudden, violent alarm shattered the silence of the room. The monitors above Dominic's bed flashed a blinding red. Cardiac arrest, necrosis spread at 98%. Dominic's body seized, his back arching off the mattress with terrifying, supernatural force. The glass canopy shattered outward, showering the room in 1,000 glittering shards. Nora shielded her face, crying out as a piece of glass sliced across the palm of her bare right hand. She didn't run. Without thinking, running on pure adrenaline and years of emergency room conditioning, Nora lunged over the broken glass. Dominic was thrashing blindly, his eyes rolled back, black blood spilling from his lips. The IV line, the poisoned line, was tearing out of his arm. "No, no, no! Stay with me!" Nora yelled, reaching out. She needed to pull the poisoned needle out. But as she grabbed his wrist, the deep cut on her palm pressed directly against the weeping, cracked skin of his forearm. Her warm, mortal blood mingled instantly with his toxic, blackened veins. The reaction was explosive. A shockwave of sheer kinetic force blasted outward, throwing Nora off her feet. She slammed into the medical cart, scattering vials and trays across the pristine tile floor. Gasping for air, Nora scrambled backward, clutching her bleeding hand. She looked up at the bed, terrified that she had just killed him. Instead, the impossible was happening. Where Nora's blood had touched Dominic's skin, a brilliant, burning golden light was spreading. It wasn't magic. It looked like aggressive, accelerated cellular regeneration. The black, necrotic veins racing toward his heart suddenly stopped. Then they began to violently recede, retreating down his arms, flushing out of his neck. The cracked, grey skin stitched itself back together in seconds, revealing flawless, pale flesh beneath. The monitors, previously screaming in red, began to steadily ping. His heart rate stabilized. His core temperature spiked back to normal. Nora sat on the floor, trembling violently, staring at her own blood-stained hand. What did I just do? She didn't have a rare, magical gift. She was just Nora. But she recalled a passing comment a hematologist made years ago when she donated blood. You have a genetic anomaly, Ms. Hayes, a null allele in your O-negative blood type, completely harmless, but incredibly rare. Harmless to humans, perhaps, but to a vampire dying of synthetic silver poisoning. Her blood was the ultimate molecular antidote. A low, deep groan rumbled from the bed. It wasn't the weak gasp of a dying patient. It sounded like a predator waking from a long winter. Nora froze. Dominic Ashford slowly sat up. The IV lines snapped like brittle thread against his chest. He looked down at his own hands, flexing his fingers, watching the last remnants of the black poison evaporate from his skin. Then he turned his head. His eyes locked onto Nora. They were not the clouded, dying eyes she had seen for 3 days. They were a piercing, luminescent silver, burning with an ancient, terrifying clarity. He didn't look at her like a patient looks at a nurse. He looked at her like a starving man looks at a feast. Before Nora could even blink, Dominic moved. He didn't walk. He blurred. In a fraction of a second, he was off the bed and crouching directly in front of her on the floor. The sheer, overwhelming aura of his power made it hard for Nora to breathe. He was 7 feet of pure, lethal muscle, and he was staring intently at the bleeding cut on her hand. He reached out and took her wrist. His touch wasn't rough, but it was absolute. An iron grip wrapped in velvet. You, Dominic whispered, his voice a dark, resonant baritone that vibrated right through her ribs. He lifted her bleeding hand to his face, closing his eyes as he inhaled the scent. It was you. I just pulled the IV, Nora stammered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. You were dying. The medicine, it was poisoned. They've been poisoning you. Dominic's eyes snapped open. The silver in his irises darkened into a storm cloud grey. He didn't seem surprised by the betrayal. He only seemed focused on her. I know, he said softly, his thumb gently brushing over her pulse point. I was trapped in my own mind. I felt every lie they told. I felt every drop of acid they pumped into me. And I felt you. He leaned in, his lips brushing mere millimeters from her bleeding palm, though he didn't bite. I felt you wiping the blood from my hands when they left me to rot. What is your name, little savior? "Nora," she whispered, unable to look away. "Nora Hayes." "Well, Nora Hayes," Dominic said, standing up and effortlessly pulling her to her feet with him. He looked toward the heavy oak doors of the medical wing. Footsteps were echoing down the hall. Fast. Heavy. Cassian and the healers had heard the alarms. They were coming back to finish the job. Dominic's jaw clenched, his fangs slowly descending. "You just ruined a very expensive, very careful assassination attempt. My brother is about to walk through those doors expecting a corpse. When he sees I am alive, and when he smells your blood on my skin, he is going to tear you to pieces." Nora's stomach dropped. "I just wanted to pay off my mortgage," she breathed, the reality of the situation crashing down on her. A dark, dangerous smirk pulled at the corner of Dominic's mouth. He stepped protectively in front of her, shielding her small frame with his massive body. "Don't worry about your mortgage, Nora," the Vampire King murmured, his eyes fixed on the door as the handle began to turn. "You belong to me now, and no one touches what is mine." The heavy oak doors exploded inward. Splintering into jagged shrapnel that rained across the pristine Italian tile. Cassian stepped through the dust, his crimson eyes gleaming with predatory anticipation. Behind him trailed the royal healers, Dr. Arthur Pendleton, clutching a customized tablet, and Dr. Miriam Croft, carrying what looked like a cryogenic harvesting case. They had not come to mourn. They had come to extract Dominic's bone marrow to synthesize the longevity serum that would make Vanguard Capital the most powerful pharmaceutical entity on Earth. Cassian opened his mouth to deliver a practiced, grief-stricken eulogy for the security cameras. The words died in his throat. Dominic was not a rotting corpse. He was standing in the center of the shattered glass canopy, his posture radiating lethal, terrifying authority. And tucked safely behind his broad shoulders was the human hospice nurse from South Boston. "Arthur," Dominic said. His voice was a quiet, terrifying rumble that caused the surgical instruments on the metal trays to vibrate. "Did you honestly think L-carnosine stabilizer would mask the scent of synthesized silver nitrate?" Pendleton's face drained of color. The world-renowned hematologist took a staggering step backward, dropping his tablet. "My lord, We were trying a radical therapy. You were trying to liquidate my assets," Dominic interrupted, his silver eyes locking onto his younger brother. "A hostile takeover, Cassian, using my own medical staff as the assassins. It's unoriginal, even for you." Cassian's shock morphed into a snarl. "Kill him," he roared, pointing a clawed finger at Dominic. "He's weak. The necrosis drained his reserves. Take him down and drain the human." 4 heavily armed tactical guards, mercenaries from a private military contractor known as Aegis Solutions, surged into the room, raising automatic rifles loaded with UV incendiary rounds. They didn't even get to pull the triggers. Dominic moved faster than human biology could process. He was a blur of violence and grace. He crossed the 30 feet of the medical suite in a fraction of a second, seizing the first mercenary by the tactical vest and hurling him with such concussive force that the man shattered the reinforced concrete pillar in the center of the room. Gunfire erupted, deafening in the enclosed space. But Dominic was no longer there. He reappeared behind Pendleton. The doctor didn't even have time to scream before Dominic's hand clamped onto the back of his neck, crushing the cervical spine with a sickening crunch. Pendleton crumpled to the floor. Nora clamped her hands over her ears, crouching behind the overturned medical cart. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. She had spent her life saving people, stabilizing them. Now, she was watching a centuries-old apex predator dismantle a corporate assassination squad in real time. Dr. Miriam Croft tried to run, sprinting toward the shattered doorway, but Cassian grabbed her by the hair and threw her back into the room as a distraction. "Hold him off!" Cassian bellowed to his remaining guards, his cowardice overriding his ambition. He turned and sprinted down the subterranean hallway, abandoning his co-conspirators. Dominic didn't give chase. His priority was not revenge. It was the fragile human trembling behind the medical cart. He dispatched the remaining 2 guards with brutal clinical efficiency, leaving the medical suite eerily silent, save for the hum of the backup generators and the ragged sound of Nora's breathing. He walked slowly back to her, stepping over the carnage. The terrifying, monstrous aura he had projected only seconds ago vanished, replaced by a suffocating, intense magnetism. He knelt beside the cart, offering his hand. His skin was flawless, pale, and completely devoid of the necrotic black veins that had plagued him for a month. "Are you injured?" he asked softly, his silver eyes scanning her face, then dropping to the bleeding cut on her palm. I'm okay," Nora stammered, letting him help her up. Her legs felt like lead. "You killed them. They were world-class doctors, and They were butchers hiding behind medical degrees," Dominic corrected gently, pulling a sterile gauze pad from a surviving tray and carefully wrapping her hand. "They were being paid $70 million by my brother to ensure my immune system collapsed, so Vanguard Capital could patent my genetics. Welcome to the real world of high finance, Nora." He finished tying the bandage, his thumb lingering against her wrist. He could feel the chaotic, rapid flutter of her pulse. "We need to leave this estate," Dominic stated, his tone shifting back to calculating CEO. "Cassian is a coward, but he is a well-connected one. By dawn, he will freeze my accounts, lock out my biometric access to the syndicate, and put a bounty on both of our heads. He knows your blood is the only thing that can neutralize the poison. That makes you the most valuable asset on the eastern seaboard." "Me?" Nora gasped, panic finally breaking through her shock. "I'm just a nurse. I have a foreclosure notice on my house. I can't be a target for a billionaire vampire cartel." Dominic stepped closer, his imposing frame completely invading her personal space. He reached out, his cool fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw, forcing her to look up into his mesmerizing eyes. "Listen to me," he commanded, his voice a silken anchor in the storm of her panic. "I am Dominic Ashford. I own the banks that hold your mortgage. I own the hospitals where you work. And as of tonight, I owe you my life. I will let the sun burn me to ash before I let anyone touch a single hair on your head. Do you understand?" Nora looked into those ancient, unyielding eyes. She had been alone for so long, drowning in debt and grief, fighting just to keep her head above water. Now, the most dangerous creature she had ever met was offering her absolute protection. She swallowed hard and nodded. "Okay, where do we go?" A fierce, predatory smile curved Dominic's lips. "To reclaim my empire. But first, we need a new wardrobe." They bypassed the estate's main garage, which was undoubtedly swarming with Cassian's loyalists, and took a hidden service elevator to a private airstrip. A stealth-coated Gulfstream G650 was waiting. By 4 a.m., they were in the air, flying straight toward Manhattan. The safe house was a triplex penthouse in Tribeca, completely off the grid and registered under a dummy corporation. It was a fortress of glass, steel, and unadulterated luxury. Once inside, the adrenaline finally left Nora's system. She collapsed onto a massive leather sofa, her exhaustion hitting her like a freight train. Dominic, however, was a force of nature. He made 3 phone calls, speaking in rapid, fluent Russian and French, mobilizing loyal factions within his global syndicate. When he finally ended the calls, he walked over to the kitchen island and poured 2 glasses of 20-year-old Macallan whiskey, handing one to Nora. "Drink," he ordered softly. "It will help with the shock." She took a sip, the amber liquid burning pleasantly down her throat. Dominic sat on the coffee table opposite her, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Why did you do it?" he asked, suddenly. "Victoria Pierce told you to stand in the corner and let me die. You stood to make $50,000. Why did you cross the glass?" Nora looked down at her bandaged hand. "Because you were dying alone," she whispered. "I watched my mother die in a sterile ICU room for 6 months. The doctors treated her like a broken machine, not a person. No one deserves to be looked at like a problem to be solved. You were in pain. I couldn't just stand there." Dominic's expression softened, a profound, ancient sadness flickering in his silver eyes. "For 300 years, people have looked at me as a bank account, a weapon, or a monster. You are the first person in a century to look at me as a patient, as a man." He reached out, taking her bandaged hand in his. "Your blood cured the silver nitrate, Nora. But the anomaly in your DNA, the null allele, it did something else. When our blood mingled, it initiated a biological bond, an epigenetic shift." Nora's eyes widened. "A what?" "A mate bond," Dominic clarified, his voice dropping an octave, rich and vibrating with raw desire. "In vampire biology, it is a myth, a fairy tale to keep the young ones romantic. But I can feel your heartbeat in my own chest. I can smell your fear, your exhaustion, and your courage. My biology has recognized you as its equal, its anchor." Nora's breath hitched. She should be terrified. She was sitting in a penthouse with an immortal billionaire who had just declared her his genetic soulmate. But looking at Dominic, she didn't feel fear. She felt a magnetic, overwhelming pull. The cold, lonely edges of her life were suddenly filled with a burning, protective warmth. "I'm a human with $70,000 in medical debt," she murmured, tears of exhaustion welling in her eyes. "I don't belong in your world, Dominic." "Your debt is already erased," Dominic stated matter-of-factly. "While you were sleeping on the plane, my accountants bought the bank that holds your mortgage and flagged your file as paid in full. As for my world, you are the only thing in it that matters." He leaned in, closing the distance between them. His lips brushed against hers. Hesitant at first, testing the waters. Nora let out a soft gasp and closed her eyes, leaning into the kiss. It ignited a firestorm in her veins. He tasted like expensive whiskey, danger, and absolute devotion. When he pulled away, both of them were breathing heavily. "Rest," Dominic commanded softly, kissing her forehead. "Tomorrow, we take back my company." The next evening, the board of Vanguard Capital was holding an emergency restructuring meeting on the 81st floor of the Chrysler Building. Cassian Ashford stood at the head of the massive mahogany table, flanked by high-powered attorneys and corporate fixers. "With my brother's tragic and sudden passing," Cassian announced to the room of 20 executives, feigning a somber tone, "the controlling shares of the Ashford Trust naturally default to me. We will immediately liquidate the philanthropic divisions and pivot entirely to the biochemical longevity patents Dr. Pendleton left behind." "I wouldn't advise that, Cassian." The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. Cassian's face went the color of ash. Dominic Ashford strode into the room, looking like a god of vengeance in a custom-tailored charcoal suit. He radiated absolute power, his silver eyes pinning Cassian to the spot. But it wasn't just Dominic who commanded the room's attention. Walking beside him, her hand securely laced with his, was Nora. She wore a stunning, emerald-green silk dress that Dominic had procured, her chin held high. She was no longer a terrified nurse. She was the anchor of the most powerful immortal on Earth. "Dominic," Cassian choked out, backing away from the table. "You're dead. The medical reports were falsified by a traitor who is currently rotting in the incinerator of my upstate estate," Dominic finished smoothly. He walked to the head of the table. The executives, realizing they were caught in the middle of a supernatural coup, shrank back in their leather chairs. "Your little conspiracy failed, brother," Dominic said softly, though the menace in his voice made the glass water pitchers on the table tremble. "The El Kana sign, the silver nitrate, the tactical squad, all of it. You forgot the first rule of this family: never leave a job unfinished." "Guards!" Cassian screamed, drawing a silver-plated sword arm from his jacket. He aimed wildly at Nora, knowing she was the source of Dominic's recovery. Before Cassian could even pull the trigger, Dominic moved. He didn't just disarm his brother. He drove his fist entirely through the solid mahogany table, shattering it, and seized Cassian by the throat, lifting him 3 feet off the ground. "You aimed at my queen," Dominic snarled, his fangs fully descended, his eyes bleeding from silver to pitch black. "That is an offense I do not forgive." With a sickening crack that echoed through the silent boardroom, Dominic snapped Cassian's neck. He tossed his brother's lifeless body onto the floor as casually as one might discard a piece of trash. He pulled a monogrammed silk handkerchief from his pocket, delicately wiping his hands before turning back to the terrified board of directors. "Are there any further questions regarding the transition of leadership?" Dominic asked, his tone perfectly polite, perfectly lethal. 20 executives shook their heads in terrified unison. "Excellent," Dominic smiled. He turned back to Nora, the monster instantly vanishing, replaced by the man who looked at her like she hung the stars in the sky. He offered her his arm. "Shall we go home, darling?" he asked. Nora looked at the terrified billionaires, the shattered boardroom, and the immortal king waiting for her. She smiled, looping her arm through his. "Yes," Nora said, stepping over the ruin of his enemies. "Take me home." If you loved this story of power, betrayal, and dark romance, you won't want to miss what happens next in the Ashford Empire. Hit that like button if you want more supernatural drama. Share this with your friends who love a good plot twist, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss a tale. Drop a comment below. What would you do if you found out your patient was a vampire king? Let me know.